So we're going to be using all of our materials now. So let's take a look at my little table here, because you're going to want to set this up similarly. So think of this like a surgeon's table. This is your artist's table, and what I have on here is my 6B charcoal, my black Conte, my white Conte. I've got my pastel charcoal, I've got a pencil, I've got a couple of different erasers. I actually have 4 different erasers here. If you just want to start with these guys, that's fine. I have my pencil that's been sharpened, so we did the materials prep, so now you know how to sharpen your pencil and your blending stumps. And I have my chamois, my cloth. I usually have a dirty one and a clean one on hand, so if we're just starting out and you only have a clean one, don't worry, it'll be dirty soon. I have my 2 razor blades and my sandpaper, just in case I drop one of these and have to start all over, or drop my pencil and have to start all over and sharpen it really quick. And so I lay this out like a surgeon's table, and I don't just like grab one thing at a time out of my art box, because if I don't see it, I'll tend not to use it. So this is our setup, and now let's talk about how these materials work. So let's take a look at how these different materials look on the paper. So we've been using our 6B charcoal, and so what we're going to do is look at how it lays on the paper and how we can kind of lay it down. So if I say just go ahead and, put a nice, so we sharpened it so it gives us a nice grain, we can see how it really works into the paper, into the grain of the paper. You want to soften it in. And we'll see that as we build this up and keep pushing it into the paper, there will come a point at which it kind of reaches saturation and it won't get much darker. So I can kind of keep pushing this in a little bit, and as I push it in, you can see it's not getting a ton darker anymore, right? The nice thing is it's really nicely into the tooth of the paper. So your cloth will always push things into the paper, whereas your chamois will always take you to a middle gray. So here's what my chamois will do. It's kind of like an eraser, or if it's dark, if I have it dirty already, I can use it to glaze onto the paper as well. So think about that. If I've gone too far, the charcoal technique is really forgiving. So if you make a mistake, I can chamois it out, I can erase it out. So say my 6B's kind of reached its limit for what it can do. And so now I'm going to switch to my black Conte crayon. So the black Conte crayon with its wax base can get even darker. And as I push this in to the paper, you can see that richness coming out. And it'll go a few levels. And get as dark as I can on this. And sometimes I'll just leave this, or I'll just kind of push it in a tiny bit. Each time I wipe down, if I want it to get darker, I use less and less pressure. So I might either just barely wipe it down, or I might just leave it. And finally, I think this is dark. However, now I'm going to grab my pastel charcoal. And remember, we don't need to, this is so soft that it self-sharpens. So you can see that I've just kind of been drawing with this, and it's already making its own little cone type of shape. This is where we'll get really dark. And this is so soft that if I use my towel, it'll take it up. So I got to just push it into the paper with my hand. So you can see our range that we're getting with the 6B, the black Conte, and then our pastel charcoal. So that's how dark we're going to get with it. And then we also want to utilize our erasers. So remember, the chamois will even take away that pastel. So the chamois will take things away, and then so will our erasers. So I'm going to take, and I'm just going to take a piece of my kneaded eraser off, because I've got a large one, and I'm just going to knead it in my hands a little, and I'm going to start to erase. And you can see that the kneaded eraser starts to erase, and it erases pretty well, especially if I've chamoised things out first, but it kind of reaches a limit too. And then if I grab my hard eraser, you can see that I can get out even more. Here's what we have to make sure and do when we're using the white Conte. I need to erase out as much as I can before I put this down, and here's why. Let me show you. This is the white Conte on the dark. And I'm really pushing down, like I could almost break this here. Here it is if I erase out first and then put it in. You can see the difference. So we don't want to just, we don't want to trying to get it light enough and it just won't do it unless I erase out, and I can even use my kneaded eraser so you can see the difference. So we want to, in addition to understanding how we can get the whole value range with what we've got with our pencils and erasers, we want to talk about two things. One is hatching and one is glazing. So hatching is kind of what it implies. I'm going to be making little hatch marks. And what that's going to do is it's going to give us one more level of value while keeping the luminosity underneath. And if you wipe down these hatch marks, there's two things you can do. You can either wipe with the grain to reinforce them or wipe against the grain to soften them. So I can come in and say, okay, I want to go just one more level of dark here. So I'm just going to hatch in a little bit. And you can see that we're seeing what's under it, but it's a little darker than this area down here is. I can also hatch with my eraser, either my kneaded eraser, if I want to just take if I want to take a level of light out, you can see that we're getting it, and you could do it anywhere. I'm just getting a little bit out of here. I could use my hard eraser. I could use my little tiny eraser. And what I really like to use hatching for is to reinforce planar changes. So when you see the side of something or the underneath of something changing from the front or the top, that really, the hatching really works for that. And then also you can do layers of hatching. So maybe I have this, or maybe I'm hatching over the dark that I put in there. So then it starts to kind of blend. And what we get is a little bit of a 3D effect. So we're not as flat when we start to hatch things down. The second thing we want to do is called glazing. You can glaze either way as well. So if I get my kneaded eraser and I make a little pad with it, I can come through and just take one soft level off. Let me get this just a little more even. There we go. I can take one soft level off all the way down, right? And I'm just taking a little at a time. I could continue to like build that up if I wanted. I can also glaze with a dirty towel. So doing the opposite. So if I need to add something soft, I could do that with my towel. My chamois will do it. And remember, the chamois kind of always takes you to this middle value. And you can even do it with your blending stumps. So these are soft, clean blending stumps right now. But say I came in here and I wanted to blend these edges in. Right, so I'm blending in this hatch that I had and getting a nice edge. And now my blending stump's dirty. I can also glaze with that too. So hatching is the creation of little kind of mark making. It's mark making lines, and you can do it with any of your erasers, and you can do it with also your charcoal or your pencil. And then glazing is taking one soft level or one or more. So you can do it with your eraser, and you can do it with your cloth or your chamois or your blending stump. So this is kind of how the materials work. Let's take a look at how we create a value range on a simple sphere. So I'd like to do a simple sphere for you and then show you how that transfers to the torso and pelvis. So how do we get that to also look volumetric on a real person? We want to start off with our 6B charcoal again. Because that is the lightest, and if we make mistakes, it's easy to get rid of it. So I'm going to make a little sphere in an environment. So you're going to start off just drawing in your sphere. Here's your shape. So if you were drawing a person, this would be your armature. You'd have your rib cage, pelvis, etc. And we're going to do that in just a second. And here's the background. And I'm going to also draw a cast shadow for the sphere. So if my light's coming this way, it's going to hit here, and I'm going to mass in these planar changes of the sphere, and it's going to cast a shadow. So I'd mass in the planar changes. I want to do like a medium value. I want to show that the sphere's casting a little shadow. If I feel like I'm going to lose something, I'll just reinforce that edge just a little. And I want to put in, I'm going to rough this edge up a little. I want to put in something in the background. Now, the background in artwork is known as the space tone. And the reason that we're calling it the space tone is because it's an important aspect of the drawing. So it's not just there haphazardly. We use the space tone to reinforce and bring out the figure or the object. So what's going to happen is you're going to prove the light source with the shadows. The space tone can be anything. So I can go dark to light, I can go light to dark, I can do one side to the other. Whatever I think is going to look nice with my piece. And this is going to be your artistic decision. So what I'm going to start with is a medium value. So when we're doing these long-term drawings, we're just going to start everything with a medium value. And notice how I'm getting rid of these edges. So don't be afraid to come right up to the edge. If you feel like you need to reinforce it a little, you can. So you're going to end up with something like this. We are going to eliminate any lines we don't need because I don't want to push those into the paper. When we draw our figure, it's going to be measurement lines, just like we were doing in our gestures. Symmetry lines, measurement lines. So anything that you don't need, get rid of with your eraser. And now what we're going to do is we are going to push this in so that it's smooth like this, and then we can start working back and forth. So I'm going to take my dirty cloth. I'm going to step on my easel. So you can't see this, but I'm stepping on my easel. I'm grabbing the board because I really want to get in here. Don't be timid at this stage. Really get in here and just work the charcoal into the paper. You can see that I'm not losing anything. The only time you'll lose it is if you go too dark or heavy with it. And you'll notice if you go too light, when you try and wipe down, nothing will happen. I've seen a lot of beginners forget to put the space tone in and then they try and wipe down and nothing really happens. That means you have to have more charcoal in there. And if you put too much, then you might lose your edges. So first thing is we're just getting real soft, working into the tooth of the paper. Now I'm going to work back and forth. So we have this range, this scale that goes from our darkest dark to our whitest white. And I'm going to take my kneaded eraser and I'm going to just start to pull out the form a little bit. So here you can see the sphere. And remember, the kneaded eraser only takes out so much. And then we'll switch to our hard eraser. So I'm taking all this out. Maybe I'll take some of this, the ground plane. So I want to think about the ground plane changing so that I'm not looking at a flat piece of paper. I want to look into this drawing. So we vary the space tone and we vary the ground plane for that very reason, so that we get depth to the piece. So I'm taking out a little bit of this. The sphere starts to show up as a little bit of a silhouette. And maybe I'll leave it a little darker down low. And I might switch to my hard eraser just to pull out a little bit of the edge so it's much easier to see. And now I want to start to build it up a little. I feel like here's where I'd like to use my chamois a little too. I feel like I want to soften this edge because it got a little dark. So here's what we want to do. We want to start to build up our values. And if you're not sure where to start and you're a little bit afraid, start with a little bit of the space tone. Start with maybe, again, I can make the space tone anything I want. Maybe I'll do like lighter to darker. And so maybe I just start to build that up a little and I start to build the shadow up a little. The mass and the cast shadow. So I do that and then I continue to wipe down. When you wipe down and you start getting into little spaces, don't do this. Here's a mistake that people do. They will take their finger and they'll put it in like this and then they'll start wiping down, and what happens is you'll get these little like catches in it. Make a little pouch like this and then just get in there. And I'm going to start to soften this up. Again, we're trying to saturate the tooth of the paper so everything's real soft. And this is about the level that our charcoal can make it to, as far as like how many times we can keep pushing it into the paper and erasing or laying more down. And don't worry if you go like this. This is so easy to take back out. So again, the charcoal is forgiving. So feel free when you're doing this. Don't feel constrained and afraid. And so I'm building this up just a little bit more. Anytime I feel like I need to, if I lose something and I need to redraw, just come back in and redraw those edges. So ran my cloth along that, so I'll take that off a little. And so what now I'm going to switch to my black Conte. So when you're reaching for this in your art box, they look really similar. You'll see that the black Conte is a little shinier, and either it'll say Conte on it or 2B, and then the charcoal you want to it'll either say General's Charcoal or 6B on it. So what I want to do now is I want to hit what's known as the core shadow. So here's what happens. The light goes like this. It bounces off the surface and it's going to bounce back up. And the last place that those two lights meet is right along the edge, and it's called the core shadow. So I'm just going like this to kind of put that in there. I want to rough it up a little. And the reason I want to do that is because I want this middle gray to look like a reflected light. I'm not going to erase out the reflected light. I'm going to make it look like light by increasing the dark around it. And so I'm going to also darken up this cast shadow just a little. And the light's going to bounce around in the shadow too. So the shadow is not just like a hole that a golf ball would fall in. You're going to have something called the sit core. Whenever two objects come together, you see the line in between my hands. That's the sit core. And so where the sphere sits on the surface, there's usually a little rim around your shadows. That's called the rim core. And then you want to have some variation in there. I also want to get darker with my space tone. So notice that the value is kind of relative. So these darks, and now when I push this in, see how nice and deep this starts to look really nice, because now we're building it up a little bit more. Again, don't worry if it gets, I don't have to worry about that at all. I'm going to come back in and work it back and forth. So again, very forgiving. We're going to sharpen this edge that the sphere has soon. I'm working all this into the tooth of the paper again. And something like this, what I like to do for that is you can either use your blending stump if you want it to soften, or I just like to use a clean cloth and just so it's pretty messy. We're just kind of working back and forth, but that's what's so forgiving about it. Like, I don't have to stress out that a little bit of charcoal got in this background. I just get to come back and rework it. Or if I see a little bit more of a light bouncing around in the shadow, I'll make a little pad with my kneaded eraser and glaze it in there. So here's what happens if I erase this out too much. It just becomes a stripe. It competes with the light. So what I might do in this case, if I've overdone it, maybe I run a hatch and then soften that back in. Right, so I don't want anything to look stripy. I want one value to look like it flows into the next. I might come in this way as I think about this and hatch in this way just a little. Maybe I want to break up that edge some more. So you could use your hatch this way too. So that's a nice way to use it. And then take my clean cloth and soften that in there. So I'm just working back and forth, and I'm ultimately trying to get to my lightest light and my darkest dark. Let's do one more layer of Conte, and then I'm going to switch to my pastel. And then I'm going to start putting in some more light. So I'm going to push this core shadow a little bit more. And if it seems like my reflected light is too intense, I'll just hatch into it a little. I'm going to push it into the cast shadow. And let's put one more layer in the background of the space tone. I'll wipe this down, and now I'm barely wiping, I'm not pushing, I'm just kind of wiping it in just a little to soften it because I want it to stay dark. And let's start to work the other way. Let's get some light out. Let me try and get as much light out as I can. So it kind of gradates down, and I want a nice sharp edge. And now let's go to our darkest dark, because it seems like we're pretty dark, but once we grab this, what I usually do with this is I'll run a hatch to start it, and then I'll just smooth it in with my fingers. Notice how much lighter this started looking. Now I'm not sure if I might be a little bit too light. Before I thought I needed to erase, and now it's like really intense. So now I'm just smoothing it in with my finger. Your hands have oil in them, and so I feel like if you do a ton of work on your hands, you can oil up the piece, but I think with this pastel charcoal you have to, because the cloth, it's so soft that the cloth will just take it off. So here's the sit core, here's a little of that rim core. So what that means is the shadow is darkest up next to the object, and then usually along the rim, and then it starts to lighten up as it goes away from the object, and then you'll have a little light bouncing around inside. So let me put another layer, and let's put a little back here, and then I'll put one more layer in that core. So we thought we were dark, and now we can see how dark we can really get with it. Let's do one more little quick hatch. And I think I'm just going to take my regular charcoal and just run a little bit of a hatch into my reflected light, just to soften it. Again, these shouldn't be stripes. Everything should soften into the next. And when I feel like I'm dark enough on that, I'm going to prepare to add some white. So before I add the white, I'm going to need to make sure that everything is clean. So notice this back edge, I'm leaving it really soft. I want to send it away. Whatever's close, I want to be sharp. So whatever I'm going to add a little white to needs to be clean. And I think I'm going to add some back here because I think it'll bring out the sphere. A lot of times our models are sitting on light colored cloth, and they have nice shadows that are hitting that cloth, so it's good to put a little bit of white on that. So here's, again, so I'm going to take my white, and what I'm going to do with it is I want to kind of hit and then drag. And I'm showing you that on this kind of dirty part just because it's a little easier to see than it is on here. So I want to see where it, where the light is. So if my light source is coming this way again, here's kind of where it's hitting. And then I'm going to let it kind of fall away. And I don't want the white to touch the foreshadow. And then I want to put a highlight in there. And sometimes the highlight is on the edge, and sometimes it's elsewhere. So put your highlights in if you see a couple of them. And then let's also put in, I'm going to start the white on my ground plane, and then I'm going to let it kind of fade out. And in that way, it helps to bring the sphere out just a little bit more. And now that I did that, the sphere's coming out. I feel I can do just a little bit more glazing. And first let me take out just a nice edge here. I didn't want to add white to it because I want that ground plane to change. Let's show that there's just a little bit of light bouncing around in the shadow, and maybe I glaze out just a little bit more of my reflected light in a spot. So here's what we have. We have a highlight, and I had two. We have the mass light, so let me write these down. Highlight. Number 2 is this whole thing, the mass, or like the top plane. This whole thing is the mass shadow. This band right here is the core shadow. Remember, the core shadow is the last place that the light comes from here and comes from here. So it's this dark band right here. Core shadow. Number 5 is the reflected light. Number 6 is the cast shadow. And the cast shadow, we're going to look for 3 things. So 6A is going to be the sit core, so that's this. And remember, wherever 2 things come together, you see a line. That's the sphere sitting on the blanket. 6B is the rim core. So usually there's a little rim on the shadow that starts to disappear as it gets further away, the rim core. And the rest of it, so I'll make that 6C a gradient. So that we're darker up next to the object, we get a little lighter, light bounces around, and we'll look for those little reflections and things like that. And so this is just kind of a basic sphere, and this is what we're looking for, and this is how our materials work. So what I'd like to do now is let's go to a human form, and let's just see how you would do this on a quick torso pelvis before we get started with our models.